When modelling British political structures, strict applications of either pluralist or elitist frameworks are fraught with problems. By contrast, Rhodes's differentiated policy model and Marsh's asymmetric power model both provide fuller pictures of the landscape of power within British politics. However, both overlook how deep ideational changes alter the political composition of Britain across time, such as the waning power of the old Etonian Oxbridge elite and the effects of ideational penetration on government. In light of this paper seeks to imagine a new way of conceptualising British politics, tiered pluralist-elitism. I argue that this approach wields greater explanatory power as it allows for the modelling of ideational shifts across time. Firstly, an analysis of business and epistemic communities within liberal democracies, drawing on the work of Limblom, and secondly, an analysis of the role of ideational change within society and its relation to policy discourse. When analysing critical elite theory, there are two fundamental flaws: the increasing reliance on the political elite on the general public, which undermines their autonomy as elites, and the fallacy that elitist structures are often near impenetrable. Etzioni Halaby describes elites as wielders of power and influence on the basis of their control of resources. If gaining control over significant resources enables penetration of elitist structures, then those structures can become increasingly pluralised, and thus analysing a system in which the concept of an elite is more fluid and likely to be influenced by ideational change becomes far simpler. Indeed, the media elite within Britain, such as the emergent state, has a vast amount of influence over the general public due to their ownership of various media outlets. However, the increase in online media use is an example of where the multitude of individuals have influence over the public, or at least the ability to both focus and frame a political debate. Secondly, classical elite theorists often link the elites to education and upbringing. However, the evidence suggests that the number of privately educated members of Parliament has been in decline since 1980, and similarly the number of Oxford-educated MPs has decreased over the last 60 years. This evidence suggests that classical political elites are no longer a political hegemon, which, when combined with Farrell and Dresden's idea that media power is increasingly pluralised, suggests that the political elite within Britain are increasingly reliant on voter support, and thus they are restricted by public opinion and perceptions of policies. Similarly, whilst mainstream media is arguably being monopolised by parent companies such as the Murdoch estate, Farrell and Dresden posit that blogs are increasingly influential, and as such powers become pluralised by nature of the ease of access to the blogosphere. The most important flaw in pluralist theory is the naivety of state neutrality as a concept. Kim Licker argues that state neutrality is a self-defeating notion due to the fact that it undermines the very conditions under which it's a worthwhile aim, by which he means that because a government who is entirely neutral will fail to protect the fundamental culture of a state, that government, and outside of that society and culture, no individual can make meaningful choices. Furthermore, state neutrality is highly unlikely because the political elites are necessarily inclined towards consolidating their own positions. For example, Lopez suggests that the elite will favour business interests over environmental interests when it comes to matters of pollution, etc., because of economic gain. Additionally, governments have their own political agendas and must keep the support of the electorate in order to stay in power. The democratic system means that political parties must make decisions that will be perceived as correct by voters, which not necessarily is the same as being actually correct, which would possibly cloud their judgments. Whilst a dichotomy remains between these theoretical approaches, various concessions suggest that they may be drawing closer to a central consensus. The most important of these by far is the incorporation of the privileged position of business by Limblom. This strand of neopluralism incorporates the idea of a business elite. Limblom concedes that whilst pluralist interest groups may have a certain amount of influence over low politics, the arena of high politics is dominated by one group in particular, that of the business class. He explains that any government official who understands the requirements of his position will grant business persons a privileged position, because in order for a government to be successful in re-election, they need high levels of business confidence in order to maintain a healthy economy. The key points of tiered pluralist-elitism are as follows. Firstly, that those that hold power and have access to resources are necessarily elites. It's a tautology. The existence of said elites is tempered by the democratic structures in Britain and thus need to be perceived as leading well. Secondly, the ability of various interest groups to influence government policy. Thirdly, the existence of tiers of power, which dictates how and to what extent groups can influence one another. Fourthly, the government rely on epistemic communities to provide essential information and policies. And finally, that ideational change in society reflects the evolutionary, not static condition of state governance. The first of these points maintains that any individual who gains political power or power over important resources such as the media is automatically an elite, regardless of their socio-economic or class background. Furthermore, as explained in more depth above, elites in a democratic society need to be perceived as filling their mandate in order to be re-elected. Much of the premise of point 2 is covered in current pluralist literature, but key to this is the fact that because democratic elites rely on public opinion, interest groups are able to influence government policy to a certain extent by virtue of their ability to disillusion the electorate with the government, especially in cases where interest groups represent large sectors of society, such as the National Union of Students, the Trades Union Congress, etc. Both scholars of pluralism acknowledge these first 2 points, but point 3 is where the primary divergence from current academic literature occurs. It would be naive to suggest that any group can influence the highest levels. That any group can influence the highest levels of power in Britain, because not all have equal access to resources. Therefore, it's more accurate to conceptualise the British political structure as a series of tiers. The structure is essentially a triangular system with the Prime Minister at the top, followed by a Chancellor, the Cabinet, the House of Commons, the rest of Whitehall, local government, parish councils, people. You can see the line on the chart. Each of these tiers can influence those above or below them, even bypassing tiers on important issues, but via differing mechanisms. When drafting economic policies, government consults economists and other specialists in particular fields. For example, the Equal Pay Act was influenced by various epistemics, including the TUC and National Assembly of Women. Their influence evidently led to how this policy developed, and thus is an example of how epistemic communities are consulted, but often have their own agendas, which can be used to influence government. However, government is also able to influence the findings of epistemic community, and thus how the policy evolves. Given that the British political elite relies on the democratic vote to retain their power, their policies must reflect ideational change, because to do otherwise would be political suicide. Thus, if interest groups are able to influence or instigate ideational change throughout society, then they are more likely to achieve influence over policies. In this way, the British political structures are necessarily in a state of evolution or flux, rather than a static state, because of the very nature of their existence as democratic institutions. Previous models of British political structures have far more comprehensively analysed the various phenomena of elitist and pluralist facets in government, but none have managed to encompass the idea of an evolving political system. Neither have they fully embraced the ideas of both pluralism and elitism in order to gain a full map of this system. Tiered pluralist elitism builds on the works of Rhodes, Etienne and Halaby, and in particular Marsh, and provides several key pieces of analysis that go some way to fill these holes in the current literature. The framework of tiered pluralist elitism brings to the table the concept of tiers of power and how they are influenced by interest groups, including epistemic communities, and the ways in which ideational change is indicative of the ever-evolving political structures in Britain. Thank you.
So, Cameronism, right. If you put Thatcherism into Google Scholar, you get a little over 20,000 results, which is pretty immense. A huge amount of work has gone into defining retrospectively what exactly the ideological makeup of Thatcher's project was, if anything. Thatcher has proved a favourite, but we do that for every leader. It seems that political science as an academic pursuit has this fascination with picking apart actual policy and rhetoric and then fusing it all together into what we like to call an ideology. That's either to facilitate greater comparison between leaders, greater understanding of the complex interactions between social structures and agential intentions in defining policy, perhaps a greater biographical understanding of the major political figures of our times, or it's just to give bored political scientists and clueless undergraduates like me something to do. In contrast, probably because he's relatively new on the scene, a search for Cameronism yields a total of 35 results, which is then itself largely based around the work of a small number of academics, including and especially Birmingham's very own Foster, Kerr and Byrne. I think that situation will change. I think in time a lot of work will go into picking out exactly at an ideological level what Mr. Cameron is all about. Princeton's economics wizard Paul Krugman has been touring UK TV stations recently, trying by his own admission, to drum up public discontent against the idea that the prevailing orthodoxy that fiscal austerity is necessary medicine. Most authors at least note Cameron's preoccupation with deficit reduction, and are happy to say that in some sense this should be really important to how we see Cameronism. I agree, and in my paper I place plenty of emphasis on that. There's plenty of early debate moving on the boring old, one nation versus Thatcherite conservatism debate. Is Cameron a one-nation Tory on the relative left of the party, or is he a Thatcherite neoliberal on the right wing of the party? Most of that debate comes down on the Thatcherite side, perhaps unsurprisingly. Commentators like Kerr, Dorey, Hay, Green, Evans, Finlayson, etc. all stop just short of suggesting that he's some kind of second incarnation of Mrs. T. I'm not so interested in the question myself. I think the Tory party has generally swung backwards and forwards on that continuum throughout, on imagined continuum, throughout history, more prompted by circumstance than doctrine.